You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 139. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm thrilled to be introducing you or reintroducing you to today's guest, Bena Stock. Bena is a lawyer turned counselor for lawyers. She used to practice as a litigator, and now she is the founder of the Lawyer Mindset, and she provides counseling services to lawyers. She also is a speaker and a creator of online courses. And you may have heard Bena speak before on the podcast. She was here in November of 2022, if you can believe it, talking about how to regulate your emotions in difficult situations. And today she's back to talk to us about a topic that so many lawyers have questions about, which is boundaries. Bena, welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, Paula. And thank you so much for inviting me back. I am thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much, Bena. Thank you for coming back. For those listeners who maybe are tuning in for the first time or they haven't had a chance to hear from you before, would you please tell us a little bit more about your background as a lawyer and what it is that you do now?
Absolutely. Well, way back when in 1992, I was called as a lawyer to the Bar of British Columbia, and I practiced as a litigator, primarily in the area of medical defense and insurance defense for 21 years. And then I went in-house to the Lawyers Indemnity Fund for several years. And while there, I was inspired to consider obtaining a degree in counseling because I found that the emotional challenges that many of the lawyers who reported a claim or a possible claim were experiencing were something that I could maybe help them with. So I went back to school. I got a master's degree in counseling. I am a registered clinical counselor. I worked with the Lawyers Assistance Program for about 3 years before opening my own private practice in March of 2020. So it's been a bit of a journey and a ride. And about a year ago, I rebranded to the Lawyer Mindset because I found that there was really a theme that many of my lawyer clients experience with some of the challenges they have. And it's really a mindset that many of us have when it comes to overcoming those challenges. So I do one-to-one counseling, and I also deliver courses, and I teach for law firms and other organizations as well.
Amazing. And Bena, I think one of the things that I know I appreciate with you and that others appreciate about you is that you've walked the walk, right? You've had the experience of being in the courtroom, litigating, all the experiences that come with 21 years of legal practice. And then you've also had that unique lens of being able to see the claims coming in, right? And what is it about those claims? And you identified that there are certain, it sounds like the emotional side of it, right? That maybe was a contributor to some of the situations that you were seeing. And now you've got that training, the counseling training. And so you bring this very unique perspective and skill set to the work that you do with lawyers. And I think it just sets you up to be such a unique helper for all of us who are trying to learn more, right? On the emotional and the practice management side of it. How do you bring those all together? Today, we're talking about boundaries, which again is a topic that so many lawyers struggle with. And I would love to hear from you how you would define boundaries.
Boundaries are such an important element of healthy relationships. Boundaries are ways to communicate our needs through our words or our actions. Quite often, we think that we can only communicate a boundary by telling people what we want, which of course is one way, but we can also communicate a boundary by leaving a situation that we feel is unsafe or that we don't want to be part of. Healthy boundaries allow you to form mutually respectful relationships. And without them, we risk being mistreated or enmeshed, which is when we are so connected to somebody, we don't really have our own identity. They allow you to become an independent person. And Brene Brown says it best. She says boundaries are what's okay and what's not okay for you.
I love that. It's such a great way to think about boundaries. And, I'm not sure that boundaries was something that was really high on the radar, certainly not when I was growing up, right? It was you just do what people tell you to do. And this concept of boundaries isn't something that I really stumbled upon until probably relatively recently. I would love to hear from you, Bena, the correlation that exists between the boundaries that a person has and their family of origin, like the way that they grew up.
Yeah, that's a really good question because we begin learning about boundaries at a very young age. And so, if you grew up in a family where perhaps your ideas, your thoughts, your needs, your wants weren't respected, weren't answered, you may have grown up with the messaging that you don't have the right to express your needs and your wants, right? You may have routinely put other people first. You may have compromised your principles. You may have remained silent when you wanted to speak up. You may have even compromised your values without realizing that you're just as important as everyone else. And when we're growing up, being accepted by our family it's literally a survival instinct, right? We depend on our parents or those people who are taking care of us for our survival. So making sure that we do what's necessary to keep them happy, to avoid making them upset, becomes essential. So you learn those rules, whether they're explicit, right? Don't talk back, speak only when spoken to, children should be seen and not heard, whatever those rules are. You want to cry, I'll give you something to cry about, is sort of a favorite one, right? And the implicit rules that you need to follow. And maybe you grew up in a family where there was a mental health issue, or there was an addiction, or maybe a parent who was absent physically or emotionally. If so, you probably learned how to become hypervigilant to the emotions in the environment, right? Which way the wind is blowing on any occasion, so that you did what you needed to do in order to perhaps avoid conflict. And here's the thing, we don't leave what we learned in our family of origin behind when we become adults. We take those strategies that we develop, those ways of coping, we take them with us in all of our relationships, even if they don't serve us and even if they're harming us. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that we have personal rights, because if we don't believe we have the right to respect or to have our needs met, we're not going to ask for that in our relationships. And we're going to continue to use those same coping strategies that we used when we were growing up, often to our detriment.
Yeah, that is so well said, Bena. And I imagine that the coping strategies too that you're developing when you're a child, they may work for you as a child, but as a grown-up, you're probably able to come up with some strategies that weren't available to you at that time. There's a really great book. I think it's Nedra Tawwab, and the book, I believe, is Set Boundaries, Find Peace. Oh, good. And did I get her name right? Amazing. So we'll link to that in the notes to the podcast episode. And I read a part of that book. She talks about how those boundaries start at such a young age. So even your parents overriding your food preferences. If you don't like peas and your parents make you eat your peas, that's implicitly telling you that you don't have that autonomy, right? That you must eat your peas, even if it's not what you want. Or, you've got that Aunt Meredith who likes to come and give you a big wet kiss on your cheek and you don't want that. And your parents say, well, no, you absolutely have to go along with that. So there's all these subtle ways in which our boundaries as children are, in a sense, it seems like a strong word, but violated is the first word that comes to mind. And we're taught that that's just normal, right? That that's what we need to expect. And so I found that book really fascinating from looking at it from my own childhood, but also as a parent to a child or two children and thinking, where am I unconsciously undermining their own boundaries? And so with the benefit of that awareness, I try not to do that as much. I'm sure I'm still I'm still human. I'm probably still trying to make them eat their peas when they don't want to sometimes. But it's really interesting when you start to think about how early on we're learning the messages about boundaries. And so love that the way that you explained it.
Because we're all doing our best as parents, right? So just sort of in response to you saying, well, I'm sure that I still am trying to get them to eat their peas. This part of the conversation isn't about like throwing parents under the bus or even abdicating responsibility for our own behavior, right? I think it's an important conversation to have because it's about recognizing patterns, right? And so if I'm in a work environment and I feel that I'm in a relationship where I'm not being heard, I'm always saying yes, I feel like I'm afraid to speak up, right? I like to say, is this a pattern, right? Ask yourself, have I felt this way before? Does this feel familiar? And if it does feel familiar, when have I felt that experience before? So it's about recognizing that our parents really did the best they could with what they had. I think that's true for 99% of parents, right? And we can learn from that and move forward.
Beautiful. And thank you for clarifying that, Bena, because I think as parents, we are all doing the best that we can. And, awareness is a big thing, right? This is not something that we are necessarily taught in school or that we have a lot of knowledge about, which is why we're so glad that you are here to help us. You mentioned that the way that you may have learned boundaries in your family of origin then brings itself into other aspects of your life. And today, we're really looking at the workplace. And so I'd love to hear from you how a person's relationship with boundaries may manifest in the workplace.
Well, let me answer that by tying the two questions together, the one we just talked about, how you are when you're growing up. And one thing that I see quite often in high achievers, and I think it's fair to say that many lawyers are high achievers, is the reality that we often measure our self-worth by our achievement. And that usually starts again at a very young age, right? So maybe you were raised in a family where you had to have straight A's, or perhaps you were an excellent athlete and that's what parents focused on, or both. Of course, you're going to bring that mindset into the work that you do. And I honestly can't say how many clients I've had who've told me that, they've come home when they were a kid from school with, a great mark. I got 99 on this exam, and only to have a parent say, well, what happened to the other 1%? I know what happened to me. I got 98 in genetics. I was so proud. Like, it was a hard course, right? Well, what happened to the other 2%? Now, perhaps some of that is in jest, but if you are striving for approval from somebody else, for external validation, you take some of that to heart. And so I think what happens quite often with many lawyers is that, we're given so many opportunities in the practice of law to achieve, right? That it becomes almost a life and death situation that I have to not just achieve, but I have to excel. And then I'm going to do whatever I need to do in order to excel. And then when I achieve whatever it is that I set out to achieve, well, that wasn't such a big deal. And maybe the facts were on my side if it's a trial that I won. And then we kind of minimize that. We never actually pat ourselves on the back and celebrate it. And so we're always looking to do something better. And that is a landmine for somebody who doesn't have boundaries, right? Yeah. Because we then become the people who we get things done. We're dependable, we're reliable. People can turn to us at the last minute when they're in a crunch. No matter how busy we are, we're going to find time to help somebody out. And that puts us at risk for perhaps being taken advantage of, for overworking, for burning out, for compromising our relationships, and the list goes on and on. That's just a few of the ways it shows up in a work environment.
Yeah. And what are some of the signs, Bena? And you mentioned a few just now, but what are some examples, right? Which I think are really relatable. What are some signs that maybe you struggle with boundaries?
Let's take a test. Let's imagine for a moment that we can think of a situation where perhaps you feel somebody has crossed your boundary. Maybe they've asked you to do something that you feel uncomfortable with. Maybe they've had something sitting on their desk for too long and they give it to you and now it's become a fire and they need it done ASAP. But that means that you've got to miss your child's Christmas performance or whatever the case may be. And they say to you, well, you know what? It's just a Christmas performance. Your kid's going to have lots of other Christmas performances, or can't you have somebody record it for you? It's just as good as being there. Well, imagine for a moment you saying that to somebody else. How does it feel when it comes out of your mouth? Really uncomfortable, really inappropriate, right? That means we've got a problem with boundaries. Or one that I confess I've got an opportunity for growth with. Imagine you have a moment where you have nothing to do. Nobody's asking you to do anything. In fact, I think sort of akin to this, you and I may have talked about once before. One of my favorite places to go when I was practicing law was the dentist because it was the only place where nobody was going to ask me to do anything, right? So if you've got nothing to do, can you relax, right? Many of us who struggle with boundaries are unable to do that. And so we begin to neglect our self-care. And I don't mean taking bubble baths and writing gratitude lists, which is all good, but I mean sleep. I mean nurturing those relationships that are really important to us. If we've got children, being there for our children, being there with friends and family, then we start to feel overwhelmed. And maybe we start to get angry, resentful. We figure somebody's got to see that we're burnt out and overworked, right? Yet we're the ones who are struggling to say no. So those are a few of the ways that you see people who struggle with boundaries, especially in the workplace, some of the experiences they have.
I can relate to your dentist story. The chance to just sit back in a chair, watch TV if they give you that option. Flights before Wi-Fi was available was another nice little pocket of time where you could sort of just snuggle up and rest. And I guess, Bena, one of the questions that comes up a lot around boundaries, especially for lawyers, and I would say other professionals who work in environments that are similar to law, right? There's a lot at stake. The hours can be long. Sometimes the situations you're dealing with are completely unpredictable. Sometimes there's the scenario you mentioned where someone's been sitting on a project and they give it to you well after they could have, and it requires then that you miss something that's important to you. But sometimes it's just the nature of what's been happening, right? The client has an unexpected situation that needs to be dealt with at the last minute. And so we have that environment. And then, as you mentioned, there's this culture of achievement and excellence. Lawyers who want to excel. There's achievement, there's excellence, and there's a certain sense of pride. And so within that environment, boundaries have a bit of a tricky role, right? How do you assert your boundaries in that environment? So my next question for you is in some work environments, boundaries may not be part of the culture, right? It might be one of those, we're going to throw everything at the problem and boundaries aren't really taken into account. So then how would you deal with the disappointment? Let's say you're in that situation you mentioned where there's your child's play at school, there's an assignment that's being given to you. Then how would you deal with the disappointment that might arise if you were to assert a boundary in that type of situation?
Yeah, I think that that's a reality for many, if not most of your listeners, that when you first start to set boundaries, people will be disappointed. And here's the thing, we can't change those people. We can't. I think maybe I learned that day one of counseling. You can only change yourself. So it's really up to you to set those boundaries, to dig deep and determine what's important for you. And so I've got a couple of suggestions, if you're facing that disappointment, because I think in particular, it can really happen now in our environment where we've got people working from home, we've got a hybrid work environment where some managers, bosses have the perception that we're trading flexibility for availability. And therefore, why would you set a boundary? So it can be even more challenging. Number one, keep your emotions in check. It's important to empathize with your boss or your client. It's also really important not to allow the situation to escalate. So stay calm and rational. Repeat your boundary. and your explanation if you feel that you need to. Secondly, I mentioned connecting to your values. Revisit those, right? Why did you set this boundary in the first place? Why is this important to you? What solution are you hoping to achieve? Because your boundary is your solution. Now, expect disappointment. It's going to happen, especially in a circumstance where there hasn't been any boundaries in the past, right? Because the situation is working for the other person and you're seeking to change that. And so, invariably, when that happens, the other person is going to push back, right? They may even increase the intensity or the frequency of the behavior that you found objectionable, which led you to set the boundary. So it's important for you to repeat your boundary. If, for instance, they test you, right? Maybe you've set a boundary and you've said, I'm not going to respond to work emails after, let's just say 7 p.m. Or while I'm on holiday. That's a favorite one since we've just returned from holiday. I've been speaking to many clients so far who worked through their holiday, like billed full days, even though they were in some luxurious place, right? This is so common. So if you get an email when you've said you're not available, stick to it. Do not respond to that email until you return from holiday or until the next day, and then explain why the delay was and why you're responding later. Now, it's also important to think about the solution, right? To stay solution focused. But if people do get really upset, right? If the anger escalates, if the disappointment turns to harsh words, then I think it's really time to have a difficult conversation, right? If you're a sole practitioner, then maybe it's time to sit down and really have a heart to heart with your client. If you're working in an organization where there's somebody else you can speak to for support, then that's the time to speak to somebody for support, because abusive behavior should not be tolerated.
Beautiful. Those are some really helpful suggestions. I think that idea of going into the conversation with your expectations already there, right? Knowing that there is a potential that the person is going to be disappointed, that you've got a plan in place for how you're going to respond if that happens, keeping the, as you said, not escalating, and maybe repeating the boundary if you need to. So I think these are all really practical ways for somebody to get prepared for a difficult conversation where they are going to be asserting a boundary. What are your thoughts then? I mean, we're talking about practicing in an environment that's potentially challenging to have boundaries, right? Maybe it's not the culture. Maybe there's, the deadlines, the client demands, all those things. Do you think it's possible then to have a successful legal career while also maintaining boundaries?
Yes, is the short answer. So for those who are listening, please, please seriously consider setting boundaries, because without boundaries, we are practically guaranteed to struggle with overwhelm, exhaustion, especially those of us who are trying to balance family with their career. I mean, my husband is a commercial litigator, still does trials, and we're both raised two children, and a lot of folks are trying to balance not just children but elderly families. So it becomes really difficult if you don't set boundaries. So I'd like to offer some suggestions on how you can go ahead and do that.
Please, we are all dying to hear them.
So first of all, there's never a good time to have this conversation. And I don't know about you, but when I first started learning about boundaries, and it's true, it was really only something that came to the forefront of my mind in the last few years, I would wait weeks, maybe sometimes months, to have the difficult conversation. I just want to wait for the right time. Because here's the thing, many lawyers who struggle with boundaries are also people pleasers, right? We want people to like us. We don't want to disappoint people. We don't want to feel guilty. We don't want to let people down. We don't want people to think we can't cut it. I mean, there are all of these things, right? So we want to wait for the right time to have that conversation. There's never a right time. And unfortunately, sometimes what happens is that as we're waiting, our frustration starts to build and build and build until one day something, probably minor, occurs, and we decide that that's the line that's been drawn in the sand. And we have that conversation. It's not well thought out. Perhaps it comes off a little passive aggressively or even aggressively. And guess what? It doesn't usually go very well. So if you feel you need to set a boundary, please think about having those conversations sooner rather than later. Another tip is to make sure that your boundary is clear, that it's not porous. And I know, law is a service industry, and there are times when we just have to have all hands on deck. I get that. But if you consistently show people that your boundary isn't important to you, why should they think it is important to you? They're not going to respect it. So I want to give you an example of a difference between a clear boundary and a not so clear boundary. Imagine you're going away for a weekend. You anticipate that something might blow up on a particular file. So you tell your group that you're working with, I'm going to be away this weekend, busy most of the time, but I should be able to carve out a few hours if needed. Versus, I'm away this weekend, busy most of the time, but I'm going to set aside 2 hours Sunday morning from 10 to 12 to be available. Very different. The second example is polite. It's fair. It's firm. It's reasonable. The first example is a bit problematic because people can't tell whether it really matters to you or not if they're going to be interrupting your weekend. Third tip, we've already touched on this one. That is, state and restate your boundary and reinforce it. Many of us make the mistake of thinking, okay, I'm going to work up the courage. I'm going to have that difficult conversation. I had that difficult conversation. And guess what? It kind of went not so bad. But a week later, the person crosses my boundary again. And so we say to ourselves, well, see, I can't set boundaries in law. So why even try? Repeating your boundary is part of the process, right? If you recognize this, like you said, if you're going in eyes wide open, that this is part of the process, A, you're not going to be surprised when you have to repeat it. B, you're probably not going to be upset with the other person because guess what? Your boundary is not going to be at the forefront of their mind. It's at the forefront of your mind, right? And C, you're not going to be discouraged, right? You're going to try again. Many of us, when we start to set boundaries, we make a mistake of violating our own boundaries. I don't know about you, but I have been known to put an out of office email or on my voicemail, and yet I'll respond, even though I say that I'm away, right? So we need to make sure that we don't violate our own boundaries. Because again, people are going to turn to your actions rather than your words when they're trying to figure out what boundaries that you want to set. And last tip, assume the worst. I shouldn't say assume the worst. One of our errors is when we assume the worst, right? So quite often I'll have conversations with lawyers who would rather leave their job than have the conversation about setting a boundary because they've come to the conclusion that this conversation is going to lead to them maybe being cut off from work, right? If they're working at a firm, or the client's not going to want to work with them anymore, or the answer I often get is, I'm going to get fired, right? And so we catastrophize. We imagine all of these horrible things that are going to happen. We don't think about all of the good things that are going to happen. And so when people get to that stage, I'll often say, well, what have you got to lose? Like, if you're ready to leave, why don't you just try it? Why don't you have that conversation? And it is incredible. I can't tell you how many times people have had that conversation and not only found that the person, A, was surprised that this was a problem, didn't realize it, just didn't have that awareness. B, was agreeable to respecting the boundary. And then the individual who was struggling, they go from hating their job to saying, you know what? I actually like where I work. This isn't so bad now that I've got this problem solved. So it can be really powerful.
Those are such great tips, Bena. That first one especially really resonated, right? This idea of getting ahead of those conversations, like planning on purpose to have that conversation instead of waiting till your last straw has finally fallen upon the camel's back and you're reacting, right? You're not at your best self versus being proactive. That idea of not waiting for it to start raining before you start fixing the hole in your roof, whatever that happens to be, can go a long way. I mean, all the tips are really amazing, but also that idea that if you are at that crossroads where you'd rather quit your job than assert a boundary, you truly do have nothing to lose at that point. So it makes sense to go ahead and have those conversations, even if it's going to be a difficult conversation, even if you may have to ask for your boundary more than once. So I think this is just really a great message for people to hear, especially if you're struggling. If someone is out there struggling with boundaries, doesn't really know how to assert them, is concerned about, what the consequences might be. I think this is all really, really, really helpful. You've mentioned that there are, a number of success stories that you've experienced, lawyers who've gone and had these really good experiences where they've asserted their boundary and there's been some positive changes. I'd love to hear from you what the biggest shift is that you've seen among lawyers who have learned to better assert their boundaries, and maybe some other examples that you might be able to share with us.
Well, some of the biggest shifts really are when I'm working with somebody who is not just ready to leave their job, even contemplating leaving law, because they've come to the conclusion that this is just not fixable. There really is, quite often this belief that the culture precludes even the attempt to set boundaries. And to see somebody have worked so hard to get to where they are, to want to walk away, and to watch them go through the process of sitting down and having those difficult conversations and deciding that they really like what they do. And guess what? They're good at what they do and they're going to stay in the profession. That's huge. And, it doesn't have to be really complicated. It can be one example that sometimes comes up is if you're working with somebody quite closely and you have different working styles. Maybe you are a morning person. And I was a morning person. I'd be up at 6 a.m. And before my poor assistant would open her computer, there would be a raft of emails and I would have billed over 3 hours solid, right? Well, that doesn't work for everybody. It can be really annoying and it can be difficult. And so perhaps you have a conversation with somebody and you say, well, look, I know you're an early bird. That's great. But it's overwhelming for me when I start my day at 9 a.m. to 24 emails from you. So can we think of something else that we can do? Perhaps you can, categorize your emails per file and put them in a memo, or you come up with some solution. Or perhaps we can have a time where we just spend 5 or 10 minutes in the morning where we meet. So I don't feel like I'm overpowered with, all of these emails. Or perhaps you've got somebody who's the reverse, right? Maybe they are balancing kids. And so they are unavailable at the end of the day. And then they log on maybe when their kids go to sleep at 9:30, 10 o'clock. And suddenly they start sending a whole bunch of emails to somebody junior. And that junior person is like, wow, I've been working all day. I can't respond right now. And plus my brain just I'm not firing on all cylinders. So sitting down and having the conversation that maybe our working styles are different. So is there a way that we can complement one another so that we can be at Edom and continue to work together? So sometimes we blow up the conversations as being much bigger than they actually are.
Yeah.
So those are a couple examples.
No, I appreciate those examples. And I think that idea of communication, right? Bringing it back to, we have different styles. How are we going to make our styles work together compatibly, even complementary, goes a long way. Bena, you have been so helpful. You're sharing so many wonderful insights in terms of boundaries. And I understand that you have a course that you have put together. It's specifically for lawyers who want to learn more about boundaries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. I've been teaching lawyers how to set boundaries for over 6 years now, and I have taught so many courses on boundaries to law firms, legal organizations, CLEBC, and that I thought it was about time that I launched my own. And so I'm doing that. The course is live on Wednesday, January 31st, starting at 12:30 to accommodate those folks of you who may be in court. I'm hoping you can jump on. It's an hour. It's CPD approved. by CLEBC. If you're listening and joining us from somewhere else, you'd have to check with your law society to see if it's approved there. There will be a workbook that is going to accompany the course. It's going to come with a lot of self-reflection questions, as well as numerous cheat sheets, lingo, languages, terminology you can use as you're starting to learn how to set boundaries. You can find the course, register for the course on my website. Just go to the Lawyer Mindset, go to Live and On Demand, and there's a drop-down menu there. You'll see the Live Boundaries course, and I'm promoting it on LinkedIn as well. And I really hope to see some folks there. I've also got a freebie course on how to conquer lawyer anxiety. That's on my website as well. That's for 30 minutes, and it too is CPD approved. So if anybody is struggling with anxiety, they may want to check that one out.
Beautiful. I'm so excited for you, Bena. I think these are such amazing offerings and so relatable. And just the fact that you're speaking to all these lawyers, that you've been there yourself, you know what people are experiencing, you know what it's like in the post-pandemic era and the boundaries issues that are perhaps novel to many lawyers practicing in today's world. I'm just so excited to see you putting this work out into the world and being able to help so many lawyers. So thank you. For those lawyers who are interested in working with you in other capacities, how would they go about doing that?
The easiest way is to send me an email, bena@thelawyermindset.com, and we can certainly set something up, a one-to-one counseling session. I have sort of a 10-minute meet and greet, free get to know you. You can go on my website and see what's available there as well. And if you're interested in courses, there's a list of my courses that are on the website, and I'd be happy to chat with people who might want to have me as a guest in their law firm to chat with them about whatever needs they feel need to be met in order to help their lawyers thrive.
I love it. And Bena, as you know, I've attended many of your sessions, initially in-person sessions, and then more lately virtual sessions. And we even presented together before, which was super fun. And I think, Bena, you are an outstanding speaker, and the way that you present material, it's so well thought out. It's very evidence-based and it's practical. So what you offer is very actionable. I think, looking at your boundaries course, for example, just figuring out how to assert the boundaries, what language you can use, what situations you might find yourself in where a boundary would be appropriate. So I think for anybody out there who's interested in learning more, it's such a great resource, and I'm glad you're doing the work that you're doing. So with that, Bena, I think we are going to wrap up our discussion today. It has been such a pleasure having you on. Thank you, everybody who has joined us for this conversation. I know you adore Bena as much as I do. So, Bena, thank you so much for coming back. And we'll have to have you back again. I think, there's so many topics, so many topics to discuss. Boundaries, last time emotional regulation, anxiety is, of course, another great topic for lawyers. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure and so much fun to chat with you, Paula. The time just flies by.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, with that, goodbye, Bena. Goodbye, everybody. And we'll look forward to reconnecting next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.